Hi everybody. Well, I'm sure you must all have heard about the Grievance Studies Hoax, where 3 scholars wrote about 20 fake papers and managed to get them published in high-profile journals in fields like gender studies and queer studies and fat studies. And they had this incredible success rate. By the time they were sprung, about 7 of their articles had been accepted for publication by ostensibly serious peer-reviewed journals. I'm going to show you this video showing the hilarity of these scholars, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, as they discover that their fake papers were actually getting accepted by these journals.
Just read my email, we have our first win. The dog park paper has been accepted. They don't know. We're about to tell them. Gotta read you something. Dear Dr. Helen Wilson, I have now closely considered the revisions of your manuscript, Dog Park, and will recommend its publication in Gender, Place, and Culture. You have done very good work to address the issues reviewers raised and have clarified your arguments. Thank you for your contribution to Gender, Place, and Culture, and I hope to be seeing your manuscript in print. Yours truly, PhD, Managing Editor, Gender, Place, and Culture.
Since approximately June of 2017, I, along with 2 other concerned academics, Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, have been writing intentionally broken academic papers and submitting them to highly respected journals in fields that study gender, race, sexuality, and similar topics. We did this to expose a political corruption that's taken hold of the university. By this point, several of these papers have been accepted in highly respected journals, and one that claims that dog humping incidents can be taken as evidence of rape culture has been officially honored as excellent scholarship. I'm not going to lie to you, we had a lot of fun with this project.
The reviewers are worried that we didn't respect the dog's privacy. That's the concern. We respected the genitals.
But don't let that lead you to believe that we're not addressing a serious problem. If you have a few minutes, I'll try to explain. To be clear up front, we think studying topics like gender, race, and sexuality is worthwhile, and getting it right is extremely important. The problem is how these topics are being studied right now. A culture has developed in which only certain conclusions are allowed, like those that make whiteness and masculinity problematic. The fields we're concerned about put social grievances ahead of objective truth. So as a simple summary, we call the problem Grievance Studies. To test the depth of this problem, my collaborators and I dedicated ourselves to a 1 to 2 year secret project targeting top grievance studies journals with an agreement to publicly release our findings, no matter what the outcome. What appears beyond dispute is that making absurd and horrible ideas sufficiently politically fashionable can get them validated at the highest levels of academic grievance studies.
We rewrote a section of Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism, and this journal has accepted it. Social work.
This is deeply concerning because the work of grievance scholars goes on to be taught in classes, to design educational curricula, to be taken up by activists, to influence how media is produced, and to misinform journalists and politicians about the true nature of our cultural realities. No one tolerates this sort of corruption when they find out an industry is funding biased research to make itself look a certain way. The same scrutiny should apply to research when it pushes a political agenda. And we have uncovered enough evidence to suggest that this corruption is pervasive among many disciplines, including women's and gender studies, feminist studies, race studies, sexuality studies, fat studies, queer studies, cultural studies, and sociology.
Now you can all go back, and there's innumerable videos discussing these papers in detail on YouTube, and I'm sure you can all go and have a good look at those. But I'm going to be talking today with Helen Pluckrose, who's in London, particularly about the issue, the work she did in relation to gender. Well, I'm really delighted today to be speaking to Helen Pluckrose in London. Hello, Helen.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Now, I've just shown everybody that little video where you're jumping up and down with excitement when your first paper was accepted. That must have been a fun night.
Yes, that was a good night. We'd just done a talk, I seem to remember. We'd had a few glasses of wine, and then we got back and Jim had the email saying, yes, they wanted the dog park paper. So that rounded it off nicely, because that was the silliest of the papers and the one we thought would never get in. So.
There you go. I really want to talk to you about what to me are very serious issues revealed by this grand plan of yours, but about what's happening to scholarship at our universities. And I'm obviously really interested in the gender issues that are revealed,
Right.
that are revealed by some of the papers, showing this extraordinary anti-male bias in the academy, which which your papers really expose. And particularly the one starting off with the one you were laughing about in that video, which was published in Gender, Place and Culture, which is all about dog humping as evidence of rape culture.
Yeah.
The actual paper was called, I think, Human Reaction to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity. That's a very difficult word. At urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon, which was essentially about discussion of whether we can train men in the way we train dogs to prevent a rape culture. Yeah?
Yes, precisely, because what we're finding is happening a lot now is because this power balance is assumed to exist. Scholars are looking at more and more ways of digging it out and revealing it. So this was something that occurred to us when we wanted to write something silly about dog parks, and so this idea that you could see bias in men by looking at how they respond to male and female dogs humping each other, and and it really was just so anti-male that we were fairly confident that it would be accepted, because it claimed to pick up on a rape culture in a completely different environment where there really couldn't be a human rape culture.
But what interests me, I mean, you know this work. You did a lot of research looking for relevant literature, because in order to write a journal article like this, you have to do a bit of a literature search. And you had no problem, of course, finding a heap of articles that promote this idea of a rape culture, which is part of accepted female scholarship.
Absolutely, and time and time again, it's just an underlying assumption that there is patriarchy, that there is a rape culture, and this isn't even questioned. It's just different ways in which to detect it, mostly. Yeah,
I mean, so you went back and looked through that. I mean, does it stem from? It doesn't stem from any empirical basis. It's just a concept that's thrown out there and then endlessly reinforced. Is that right?
I mean, it's there are papers on top of papers on top of papers, and so I mean, at some point, if we go back far enough, do we find anything that's solid? Possibly at some point, but the amount of things that have built on each other, we're really left with something that's quite baseless. We're just, a patriarchy exists, a rape culture exists. In this advert, in this piece of media, in this interaction. So we start everything with the assumption that there is a power imbalance with a privileged person and a marginalised person. So you're interested in gender. So any interaction that takes place between a man or a man is in the privileged, powerful position, and we look at how he's speaking and also how the woman is receiving how he's speaking in order to see how this power balance plays out. So if she feels that he said something because he was sexist, he had some biased assumptions, then that is the reality of the situation. And of course, we only want to hear from women who do read situations that way.
Yep. And I mean,
it's really a bias.
What strikes me about that, I mean, it's such a dangerous concept for our society, of course. I mean, teaching young women to be afraid of men, teaching them to believe they're at risk of male violence. I mean, it's really corrupting the trust between men and women to promote that ideology.
I think it certainly is doing problems with men and women's relationships. If people are kind of buying into this, I do think the majority of people aren't buying into this. The majority of men and women continue to have healthy and trusting relationships, but we are looking at a situation in which the male violent sex offenders, who obviously do exist, are taken as representative of a sexist, misogynistic, abusive culture.
Yeah.
The idea that, 1% of the population is a psychopath, a further percent are psychologically damaged or have some kind of criminal background, and this doesn't represent masculinity and men as a whole, isn't something that we can look at. We have to assume that this is coming out of a cultural norm.
Yeah.
And it's frankly ridiculous to claim that in the UK, in the US, in Australia, that there is a cultural norm in which violence against women is permitted. It's one of the most hated crimes. But I mean, even men in prison who have gone to prison for being sexual offenders have to be separated from the rest of men for their own safety. Of course, violent criminals exist, but trying to argue this is some kind of norm is it's just crazy.
It's just crazy. And there were a lot of other papers that fed into the same idea. I suppose I was interested in the one about masturbation, which argued that men who masturbate when thinking about a woman without her consent are perpetrators of sexual violence. Which was, to me, was an extraordinary idea. Did that one get accepted, that paper?
That one was one of the ones that was progressed. Yeah, the dildos paper got accepted as well, because that was a similar one which argued that if the reason that men don't penetrate themselves with sex toys is because they're transphobic and not feminist enough, and if they were to do so, they'd become less transphobic and more feminist.
Yeah.
So as you said, with all three of those, we're just looking at uncovering sexism in anything we can.
Yeah. But there's such a horrible assumption there that, men who masturbate thinking about women without consent, they're not going to get consent from thinking about the woman who walks down the street, are they? That's related to sexual violence is a really pernicious idea to me. And so anti-sex, so anti-male, and really dangerous that they would accept that as a reasonable notion. But you also found literature that you could support that sort of concept, didn't you?
Yes, all of our citations are real. This is what we keep saying to people who are saying, well, you can get a few papers past any field, but no, look at our citations. We have hundreds of them. Every single one of them is real. Every idea we've had is based on an idea that is already out there
and being promoted in universities, being taught to young women going through universities who then go out and influence our culture with these ideas.
I am very afraid that women are becoming more fearful if they are buying into this, as well as young men who are becoming more afraid that anything they do could be considered abusive. Yeah. I am worried about a sort of increasing fragility of young women. As a liberal feminist of the 80s and 90s, there was a much more sort of empowered, sisters are doing it for themselves attitude, where the idea that women were strong, women could cope with everything in the public sphere, they could cope with ideas even if they were ones they didn't like, ideas that were frightening perhaps. Women could cope just as well as men. This is being reversed now with this kind of ideology. We can be harmed by words, we can be harmed by ideas we don't like.
We can be harmed, for instance, about pornography. There was another paper you did on pornography and linked to sexual violence, which I was really interested in the way that played out. It was based on 3 subjects, you claimed, and the reviewers of the journal came back and said that wasn't a big enough group, so you should just rewrite the paper, leaving out any empirical work and base it on theory. Is that right?
Yes, that was what it was. I think it was 4 men, wasn't it? And they watched certain number of hours of pornography. Yeah, of course, the anti-pornography thing is much more radical feminist than intersectional feminist, but it still flies because it still makes men doing things which are generally harmless into some kind of misogynistic and abusive underlying attitude.
That's something I've looked at very carefully in the past, the whole work on this link between pornography and violence. And if you look at what empirical research is at the heart of this is, Psych 1 students being exposed to porn in a lab and then testing in a questionnaire form their attitudes to women. I mean, it's got nothing to do with real life behaviour of men and the way they react. I mean, it is absolutely everything that's wrong with psych research exposed in that particular study, I think. Yeah, go on, sorry.
As I say, there have been some studies recently, haven't there, which have shown that men particularly enjoy porn in which women appear to be enjoying themselves, and the aggressive sort of dominant submissive porn where the woman is in a subordinate position and appears to be being humiliated is actually watched by twice as likely to be watched by women than by men. Yeah. So there's obviously a lot more sort of complicated attitudes going on around sex work, around pornography.
This particular issue of pornography has got such a grip in our general community. I mean, every day there are articles talking about, how pornography is teaching boys to push women into sexual activity they wouldn't want to do. And I mean, women's magazines promoting this stuff. It's just everywhere. And really worries me that, we see such a difference in the way. And given that, as you said, I mean, some of the early second wave feminists were very pro-sex and very, there was a group who were very much challenging the Andrea Dworkin idea of sexual, intercourse being violence and so on. And there was a group saying, we don't want sexuality to be demonized. We enjoy looking at sexual material. And they've been drowned out, I think, that group now.
My mother was a liberal feminist. She campaigned for Lloyds Bank to allow women to take accountancy exams, and for women to be able to get mortgages without a male guarantor. Now, these were important things, and there was the sexual revolution, and it did have a liberal feminist element. Yep. But the liberal feminists of that generation have either, like my mother, largely retired, considering their job mostly done, or they have they've moved more into sort of social aspects and looking at the less tangible things now that we have achieved sort of legal equality. But with the whole sort of sex work and pornography, it is getting very, very complicated because we have a lot of pressure from the intersectionals against the radical feminists, who they'll refer to as SWERF, the sex worker, usually radical feminists, and they will be saying that pornography, that sex work of any kind is work, and that women who partake in it should be respected. They are not being abused. They are women with agency, and to a certain extent, that is something that a liberal feminist can get on board with. But then we still have the neurotic attitudes about sex that are sort of on top of that. So while they're stating this principle of being sex positive, if it's something a woman is choosing, we're also seeing abusive. It's read as abusive if a man were to chat up a woman, if he were to comment on her attractiveness, or to do anything which, because we're looking at this power balance, he is in a position of power just by being male. So if he is complimenting a woman in any way, then this is threatening, this is harassment. Yep. So we've got that coming, and with the whole sort of affirmative consent and the idea even of writing it down or getting consent every few minutes, which is really unsustainable by any people in the throes of actually having it, it is coming from this idea of this power imbalance, and it is coming from the intersectional side every bit as much as the radical side. Yeah. So it's really very messy.
Yeah, so complex. Now, I was interested, you were also talking about toxic masculinity at one point, and how you've had conversations with feminist scholars about what's the evidence for this. And you went back through, that paper after paper that they suggested, presumably, that you read. And it's just this process of going back through just biased ideology and no thread of evidence. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's. I think that as a very good image, if you think of the Doctors' Use houses, where things have been built on other things until they're just completely implausible. This is what the scholarship is looking like.
Yeah.
I did have, this was the one conversation that I had with a feminist, and she kept showing me the scholarship, and when I was reading it, it's just referring to things further back, and if you try to unpick it and go back to what we're actually looking at, we're looking at an idea in the first place. And so and then somebody takes it a little bit further in a different direction, then someone takes that a bit further in a different direction, and there isn't really a base to it. It was Brett Weinstein who called it to us idea laundering. We talk about
idea laundering.
These papers. That these papers get published, and then more papers cite them, and then more are written which take an idea slightly further, and it gets this kind of legitimacy built up until you no longer have to begin with the empirical evidence. It's a bit like, if you'd imagine with, say, evolutionary biology, you don't start every paper on that saying that evolution is real and this is how it works, because this is established knowledge now. So people can write papers about some aspect of evolution which just assumes it to be real. This is what has happened in gender studies, sort of ethnic studies, sexuality studies, that they've moved on from the very basis that a patriarchy exists, that toxic masculinity exists, that rape culture exists, and they're just looking at it in different ways as though this has been proved. But of course, we would argue that this is still very much an open question. What exactly is meant by patriarchy? What constitutes a rape culture? What is this ground that we're standing on?
Yeah, I feel a certain amount of guilt around this because I was on a university council, on the Senate of the ANU, the Australian National University, for like 17 years when this was really getting a grip in Australia. This was in the 1970s and 80s. And this was all, seeping into the humanities, and no one took any notice. No one ever asked, is there any evidence based to this, or any challenge to the scholarship there? I do remember deliberately trying to sit down and read some of the queer studies papers and couldn't make head or tail of them. And what I don't understand within the university is how many people know this is, to me, essentially fraudulent. You talk about corruption at its heart, and how come this has never been exposed, I suppose, is my real question.
Well, I've known people have been critical of it because, when we're looking at the postmodernists at the discourse analysis aspect of it, where we're looking at how language constructs reality, then we will find the materialists with a sort of Marxist background. They've been the strongest critics of the postmodernists. So that has been an internal battle that has been going on, but majority of people don't really understand what either of them are going on about.
That's right.
Because it is so complicated, and there's always that tiny kernel of truth there with the postmodernists. It is that we can become overconfident in received wisdom, in tradition, in things that we've just assumed to be true, and there is some benefit in taking it apart and looking at it and seeing if it really works. So there is that element, but because they are so radically sceptical, they are sceptical on principle that anything can be true, there isn't any kind of resolution to this. It just dismantles everything and then it leaves it in pieces on the floor. So what we had then in the late 80s and the early 90s were the more sort of politicized wave. We had the intersectional feminists and the queer theorists and the post-colonial theorists and the critical race theorists who are saying, well, all this constructivism is really useful, but what we need to do is get politically active about it. So some things exist, and the thing that exists is power structures.
Yeah.
So now we have to turn things upside down. So there really is an internal logic to it, and you won't get it really from reading the original postmodernists because they were just so deconstructive.
Yeah.
Now we're looking at an attempt to reconstruct, to repair things, to kind of turn the balances upside down and achieve social justice. We're looking at something something a bit different, something a bit utopian and almost cult-like.
Yeah, and really, really dangerous. I mean, like the rape culture idea, I think you know, Helen, I've been out there doing a tour of our campuses, speaking out about the lack of foundation to this whole notion of a rape culture and the really dangerous move to introduce adjudication of rape cases into our universities using lower standards of proof. I mean, this is having real repercussions for our society. And I think what's fascinating about your work is you're exposing what is the corruption at the heart of the ideas that are being promoted in our culture now. What are the chances this is going to lead to any serious move to examine what's happened to our universities and to do something about it?
We keep going back and forth on this. At times we feel very encouraged because we're getting a lot of academics who are writing to us and saying, yes, I agree with you, thank you, we can't speak out. Yep. We've also had, we've been pleased to see some empirical scholars who have previously defended these type of studies, distancing their own work from it. So there's some positive things happening there, and also I think a tide is turning somewhat as people are beginning to understand what is happening better, and also as it's getting madder and madder. As you say, the repercussions are being felt. You don't have to have read any Foucault, any Judith Butler, any Kimberly Crenshaw to have felt the kind of injustice that is cropping up here and there, the threats to freedom of speech, to freedom of belief. So I think there is a pushback coming to this, but I'm not sure how long it's going to take, because it really needs the whole epistemology, the whole way of deciding what is true to be looked at, and for there to be an expectation that there will be evidence and there will be reason before we take anything seriously.
Well, Helen,
so I think
that's right. I mean, I hope you're gathering names of people who are in universities who object to this, who would like to do something about it. Because, I mean, I've always felt the majority of people don't like what's happening here, would like to do something about it and don't know what to do. And somehow we have to mobilize those. Do you think that's, yeah?
We keep talking, and that's what we're going over and over. What is the best way to get a tipping point? Because if people who feel that they're all alone in this, if they see the problem but they can't say anything, if they knew how many other people were thinking exactly the same thing, probably in their own institutions, we could perhaps push things to having a tipping point to where people were confident enough to stand up and say, no, I support gender equality, LGBT rights, racial equality, but this method does not work. It is not just, it is not reasonable, it is not evidenced, it is not scholarship.
Yeah. Well, let's work for that tipping point. Helen, it's been wonderful talking to you today. Thanks for staying so late at night to do this with me. And I hope we can continue to talk about these issues.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been good talking.
Nice to talk to you. Bye-bye.